Elise Carter had never been the type to seek the spotlight. For 20 years, she had worked tirelessly inside the high-tech, glass-walled headquarters of TechFlow manufacturing, designing automation systems that powered some of the biggest production lines in the country. She wasn't the loudest in the room. She didn't play office politics. But when it came to efficiency engineering, she was the best. And she had just created something revolutionary. At 9:42 p.m., she sat alone in her dimly lit office, the glow of her screen reflecting off her glasses. On the monitor, a complex web of data simulations ran in real time, proof that her latest algorithm could increase efficiency by 30%, cutting costs by millions. Her pulse quickened. She had been working on this model for 6 months, refining every detail, knowing that if it worked, it could change the future of industrial automation. A knock at the door broke her focus. Elise. She looked up. Mark Reynolds, Senior Vice President of Operations, stood in the doorway, his crisp navy suit impeccable as always. She straightened. Mark. You're still here? Mark stepped in, glancing at her screen. I could say the same about you. Elise hesitated before gesturing at the data. I think I've cracked it. He raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Cracked what? She turned the monitor toward him. This. Mark leaned in, eyes scanning the projections. The numbers were impossible to ignore. This algorithm restructures the way our robotic assembly lines communicate, she explained. It predicts mechanical failures before they happen, eliminates unnecessary idle time, and adapts production speed dynamically. If implemented, we could save $40 million a year. Mark let out a low whistle. That's impressive. She nodded, trying to contain her excitement. I was hoping to present it at the next executive meeting. With the right investment, this could take TechFlow to the next level. Mark didn't respond immediately. He was still staring at the data. But something about his posture had changed, his shoulders had tensed, his fingers tapping idly against the desk. Finally, he smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Send me the full report, he said smoothly. I'll review it personally before the meeting. A flicker of unease crept into Elise's chest. Something about his tone felt off. Still, she nodded. Of course. Mark gave her a lingering look before heading for the door. Great work, Elise. We'll talk soon. She watched him leave, unease settling in her stomach. Something about the way he had looked at her work, it wasn't admiration. It was possession. And in that moment, she had no idea that everything she had built was about to be stolen from her. Elise had never been more prepared for a meeting in her life. She sat at the long, polished boardroom table, her neatly bound presentation resting beside her laptop. The TechFlow executive team filled the room, murmuring about market growth and automation trends, their tailored suits crisp under the bright overhead lighting. This was it. She had spent 6 months perfecting her efficiency model. Today, she would present it, secure funding for development, and finally step into the leadership role she had worked decades for. The meeting began as usual, financial updates, operational reports. Elise tapped her pen against the table, waiting for her turn. Then, the CEO cleared his throat. Next, Mark Reynolds will be presenting an exciting new development in automation efficiency. Elise frowned. That was her presentation slot. She turned to Mark, expecting him to correct the mistake. But he didn't even glance at her. Instead, he stood, smiling confidently, and clicked his remote. The large screen behind him lit up with a familiar set of data projections. Her projections. Her exact algorithm. A wave of cold shock washed over her. She barely heard Mark's voice as he launched into his presentation. Over the past several months, my team and I have developed a groundbreaking automation model that will increase production efficiency by up to 30%. Elise's nails dug into the pages of her report. Lies. Her name wasn't mentioned once. No credit. No acknowledgement. Mark stood there, calmly taking ownership of her work, speaking about it as if it had been his idea all along. The worst part? The board members loved it. "This could be a game changer," the CEO said, eyes alight with interest. "Brilliant innovation," another executive murmured. "Mark, you've really outdone yourself." Mark smiled modestly, as if he hadn't just stolen everything Elise had worked for. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. She knew how this worked. If she interrupted, if she accused him in front of the board, she would be seen as emotional, difficult, unprofessional. So she sat there, frozen, as Mark walked away with her future. By the time the meeting ended, Elise's hands were shaking. Executives clapped Mark on the back, congratulating him. She stormed out into the hall, her mind racing. This isn't over. She reached his office just as Mark was pouring himself a glass of whiskey. He looked up, unbothered. "Elise," he said smoothly, as if she hadn't just watched him steal her life's work. "Something on your mind?" She slammed the report onto his desk. "You stole my algorithm." Mark sighed, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Elise, you've been in this business long enough to know how things work. That was my project." "No," Mark said, leaning forward, his voice dangerously calm. "That was TechFlow's project. Developed under TechFlow's resources, on TechFlow's time." Elise's stomach twisted. He was right. Buried deep in her contract was a clause: any intellectual property created during her employment belonged to the company. Mark smirked, watching the realization dawn on her face. "I'll tell you what," he said, setting his glass down. "There's an opening for a supervisory role in operations. Less technical, less pressure. But hey, you wouldn't have to deal with all these corporate headaches anymore. A consolation prize." Like she was an aging relic being politely pushed aside. Elise's hands clenched into fists. For 20 years, she had worked harder, smarter, better than anyone else in this company. She had believed in merit, in innovation, in earning her place. But the system had never been built for people like her to win. She took a slow, steady breath and met Mark's gaze. "I don't want your good word." Mark's smile faded. "Elise, don't do anything you'll regret." She smiled back, cold, sharp, dangerous. "Oh, I won't." 2 weeks later, they fired her. Elise Carter had spent 2 decades solving complex problems, but now, sitting alone in her parked car outside TechFlow's headquarters, she was facing one she couldn't fix. They fired her. Not with an explosive confrontation, not with a legal battle, just a quiet, calculated move. A formal email. A strategic restructuring excuse. A severance package that barely covered 6 months of expenses. That was how 20 years of dedication ended. She gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Through the windshield, she watched employees walk in and out of the glass tower that had once been her second home. Inside, they were probably still celebrating Mark's groundbreaking innovation. Her innovation. She had spent 2 decades building TechFlow's future. And now? She had nothing. That night, Elise sat at her kitchen table, a half-empty glass of wine beside her. The silence in her house was suffocating. Her laptop sat open in front of her, the cursor blinking in an empty search bar. Jobs for senior automation engineers. Women over 50 starting over. What to do after being fired? She closed the screen. The truth was, she didn't know where to start. A notification lit up her phone, a text from Claire, her daughter. "Hey Mom, just checking in. Everything okay?" Elise's throat tightened. Claire didn't know. Elise had spent Claire's entire childhood being the strong one, the woman who never faltered, who built a career from the ground up so that her daughter could have opportunities she never had. How could she tell her that everything she had worked for was gone? Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then, she typed the only thing she could. "I'm fine." She wasn't. But she needed to be. Because as much as she hated Mark Reynolds, as much as she wanted to tear TechFlow apart, the worst part wasn't losing the job. It was losing herself. For 20 years, Elise had believed in the system. She thought that if she worked hard enough, played fair, and delivered real results, she would be valued. But she had been wrong. The system wasn't broken. It was built to push people like her out. And if she wanted to survive, she needed to stop trying to fit into it. She needed to build something of her own. The next morning, Elise woke up with a different kind of energy. She made coffee, sat at her desk, and opened a new document. Then, she began to type. At first, it was just a list. Strengths: 2 decades of experience. Industry knowledge. A proven ability to innovate. Weaknesses: no funding. No team. No access to TechFlow's resources. Threats: TechFlow's influence. Mark's power. Legal risks. Opportunities. She paused. Then, she tapped her fingers against the desk, thinking. The algorithm TechFlow stole was good. But she had created it. She knew every limitation, every flaw, and she knew exactly how to make it better. A new version. Faster. More efficient. A model that TechFlow didn't have. Elise leaned back in her chair. She had spent 2 decades making other people rich. Maybe it was time to do it for herself. She didn't have a company. She didn't have investors. She didn't even know if this would work. But she had an idea. And that was how every empire started. Elise Carter didn't waste another second. She wasn't ready. She had no office, no team, no money. But waiting for the perfect moment had cost her enough already. She pulled an old notebook from her bookshelf, the one she used in her early years at TechFlow, filled with scribbled formulas, half-finished ideas, and abandoned dreams. Then, she flipped to a blank page. At the top, she wrote in bold, determined strokes. TrueFlow Technologies. Her own company. She had nothing except experience, determination, and the fire of betrayal still burning in her chest. But that was enough. Elise couldn't do this alone. She started making calls. First, Priya Patel. One of the best data scientists in the field. Passed over for promotion 4 times before finally quitting TechFlow. Elise? Priya answered, surprise in her voice. What's going on? I'm starting something new, Elise said. And I need the best people. A pause. Then, when do we start? Next, Luis Ortega. Brilliant automation engineer. Laid off when he challenged TechFlow's cost-cutting measures. Luis didn't hesitate. I owe Mark Reynolds nothing. I'm in. Then, Sarah Yoon. A supply chain specialist who had spent years trying to modernize TechFlow's logistics, only to be ignored. I have a stable job now, Sarah said, hesitating. Elise didn't push. I understand. But if you ever change your mind. A long pause. Then, Sarah exhaled. Screw it. I'm in. One by one, the people TechFlow had discarded came together. They met in Elise's garage, sitting on crates and folding chairs, huddled around her laptop. This is bigger than just us, Elise told them. We're going to build something better. Something that TechFlow can't ignore. And for the first time since losing her job, she felt unstoppable. But having an idea wasn't the same as making it work. They had no funding. Elise drained her personal savings, but it wasn't enough. TechFlow controlled the industry. Every investor they approached refused to back them, too scared to go against Mark's empire. Legal threats loomed. TechFlow's lawyers sent a cease and desist letter, accusing Elise of stealing proprietary technology. She fought back. She took contract work to keep TrueFlow afloat. She rewrote the algorithm from scratch, making sure it was legally untouchable. She pitched relentlessly until one small factory finally took a chance on them. And then? It worked. TrueFlow's new automation system boosted production by 42%, saving their first client thousands of dollars. Then came the second client. Then the third. Then the fourth. And suddenly, TechFlow noticed. Mark Reynolds called an emergency board meeting. Because for the first time in his career, he had real competition. Mark Reynolds sat in his corner office, gripping a quarterly report so tightly that the paper nearly tore. Something was wrong. TechFlow had been bleeding clients for the past 3 months. Small manufacturing companies, mid-sized factories, businesses that had relied on TechFlow's automation systems for years, were suddenly switching to a startup no one had heard of. A startup called TrueFlow Technologies. He tossed the report onto his desk and turned to his assistant. Who runs it? She hesitated before sliding a printed profile across the desk. Mark's stomach dropped. Elise Carter. His former employee. The woman he had fired. The woman whose idea he had stolen. And now? She was his biggest competitor. Mark called her the next day. Elise, he said smoothly when she picked up. It's been a while. Not long enough, she replied, her voice calm but firm. I'd love to meet, he continued. Talk about the changing landscape of the industry. There might be opportunities for both of us. A small chuckle. She wasn't falling for it. Sure, Mark, she said. Let's meet. They met at a high-end restaurant downtown, the kind of place where corporate deals were made in hushed tones over overpriced wine. Elise arrived 10 minutes early. But Mark was already there, waiting. She walked in with the quiet confidence of a woman who had nothing to prove. Gone was the Elise he had dismissed as replaceable. This woman? She was dangerous. Mark forced a smile, standing as she approached. You look well. I am, she said simply, taking her seat. You, on the other hand, look like someone with a problem. His smile faltered. Straight to business, then. I won't waste your time, Mark said, leaning forward. TrueFlow is making waves, but let's be realistic. You don't have TechFlow's resources. You don't have our reach. Scaling at this level? It's impossible without a major player backing you. He folded his hands together. Sell to me. Name your price. Elise didn't even blink. She picked up her glass of water, took a slow sip, then set it down with deliberate care. Then she leaned in. You still don't get it, do you? Mark frowned. Elise smiled, but there was steel in her eyes. I didn't build TrueFlow to make money. She let the words settle. I built it to bury you. Mark's breath caught in his throat. I know every flaw in TechFlow's system, she continued. Every inefficiency, every oversight. And unlike you, I actually innovate. She sat back, tilting her head slightly. So no, Mark. I'm not selling. A long, heavy silence stretched between them. Mark clenched his jaw. You're making a mistake. Elise stood, smoothing out her jacket. No, Mark. The mistake was thinking I needed TechFlow to succeed. She turned to leave, then paused. Enjoy the next few months, she said over her shoulder. They'll be your last ones at TechFlow. Then she walked away. And for the first time in his life, Mark Reynolds knew he had already lost. Elise wasn't bluffing. In the months following her meeting with Mark Reynolds, TrueFlow Technologies surged ahead. What started as a small, scrappy startup had turned into a true industry disruptor. Clients flocked to them, drawn by TrueFlow's cutting-edge AI-driven automation, its cost-saving efficiency, and, most importantly, its ethics. TechFlow? They were drowning. Mark sat in the TechFlow boardroom, staring at a room full of angry investors. This is unacceptable, one of them snapped. We've lost 37% of our contracts in a single quarter. Our stock has plummeted 22%, another added. And now we're hearing whispers of an acquisition. Mark clenched his jaw. An acquisition? TechFlow, once an industry giant, was now being seen as weak. Vulnerable. And all because of Elise Carter. He had underestimated her. He had assumed she would fade away, just like the countless employees he had stepped over in the past. Instead, she had built something better. And now, he was the one fighting to stay relevant. But Mark wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Elise was in her office, reviewing expansion plans, when her phone rang. She recognized the number immediately. She let it ring twice before answering. Mark. A long pause. Then, his voice came through. Tense. Measured. Elise. Let's talk. She smiled. I thought we already did. This is different. He exhaled sharply. I have an offer for you. Elise raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. Another pause. Then. TechFlow is willing to buy TrueFlow. We'll make you an offer, whatever number you want. Elise leaned back in her chair, suppressing a laugh. Mark Reynolds was desperate. He knew TechFlow couldn't compete anymore. And now? He wanted to buy her out, to erase the threat she had become. She tapped her fingers on her desk, thinking. The offer was tempting. Selling TrueFlow now could make her unimaginably wealthy. She could retire comfortably, travel, invest, leave the industry behind. But then she thought about why she had started this in the first place. Mark had stolen from her. TechFlow had dismissed her. The entire system had been built to push people like her out. And now? She was winning. She didn't want their money. She wanted change. Elise? Mark's voice broke the silence. She inhaled deeply, then said. No. A sharp intake of breath from the other end of the line. Elise, he said, his tone sharper now. You don't understand. You're making a mistake. No, Mark, she said firmly. I understand perfectly. She let her next words land with absolute finality. I didn't build TrueFlow to sell it back to the same system that tried to destroy me. Silence. Then, through gritted teeth. You're going to regret this. Elise smiled. No, Mark. You will. Then she hung up. And for the first time in her life, Elise Carter knew. She had truly won. Elise sat in her corner office, staring out at the city skyline. TrueFlow Technologies had grown beyond what she had ever imagined. Fortune 500 companies were reaching out, investors were lining up, and industry insiders were calling her the woman who took down TechFlow. But victory came with a cost. After her final call with Mark Reynolds, TechFlow didn't last long. The company's stock plummeted 40%, investors pulled out, and within months, the board forced Mark to resign. Then, the layoffs started. Hundreds of employees lost their jobs. Elise knew the truth, TechFlow had been rotting from the inside for years. She hadn't caused its downfall. It had been inevitable. But that didn't stop the backlash. The headlines painted her as a ruthless disruptor. Newspaper, how one woman brought down a tech giant, at what cost? Newspaper, the end of TechFlow, a cautionary tale of innovation and revenge. Newspaper, is TrueFlow too powerful? Some called her a pioneer. Others called her a villain. At first, she didn't care. Then came the emails. From former TechFlow employees, people who had nothing to do with Mark Reynolds, people who had families to feed. I was laid off last week. I spent 12 years at TechFlow. Do you feel proud of what you did? My wife lost her job because of you. Hope you enjoy your millions. Elise closed her laptop, pressing her fingers against her temples. She had spent years fighting to prove her worth in an industry that discarded people like her. She had finally won. So why did it feel so hollow? The last person she expected to hear from was Mark Reynolds. But there he was, sitting across from her in a quiet, upscale bar, looking far less polished than before. No suit. No arrogance. Just a man who had lost everything. What do you want, Mark? Elise asked, folding her arms. He chuckled bitterly. Would you believe me if I said, a job? She raised an eyebrow. You expect me to trust you? No, he admitted. But here's the thing, you won. You built something real. And now? You're going to face everything I did. Elise leaned back, unimpressed. Which is? Mark's expression darkened. Regulators. Lawsuits. Corporate giants who see TrueFlow as a threat. You think TechFlow was bad? He scoffed. You have no idea how ruthless this industry really is. Elise wanted to dismiss him. Wanted to tell him to go to hell. But deep down? She knew he was right. TrueFlow wasn't a scrappy startup anymore. It was becoming the new TechFlow. And if she wasn't careful, she would become the very thing she once fought against. Back at her office, Elise stared at two sealed envelopes on her desk. One contained an offer from a major conglomerate, a deal that would expand TrueFlow worldwide but force her to give up control. The other? A proposal to turn TrueFlow into a worker-owned company, ensuring no one would ever be discarded the way she had been. One choice meant power. The other meant revolution. Her fingers hovered over the envelopes. What kind of leader did she want to be? She exhaled slowly, then reached for one. But which one? The real question, what would you do? Winning isn't always the end. Sometimes, it's just the beginning of a bigger fight. If you were Elise, Small Blue Diamond, would you take the deal and dominate the industry? Small Blue Diamond, or would you risk everything to change it for the better? Let me know in the comments. Elise Carter's story isn't just about revenge, it's about resilience, power, and the choices we make when we finally win. Many of us have faced moments where our hard work was overlooked, stolen, or dismissed. But when that happens, we have two choices. Accept it and stay silent. Or fight back and build something better. But here's the real question, what happens after we win? Does success mean becoming the very thing we once fought against? Or does it give us the power to change the system for the better? Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think about Elise's journey? Was she justified in her revenge, or did she take things too far? Type 2 in the comments if you think this was an empowering story of justice. Type 7 if you think Elise should have handled things differently. And don't forget, hit that like button if you enjoyed this story, and subscribe to True Tales for more powerful real-life inspired stories every day. Natalie, your storyteller, will be back soon with another tale that might just make you question everything you thought you knew. See you in the next story.